Hey, I'm Bob Kiter, and am Director of the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. I wanted to begin with a couple of reminders about upcoming programs. Actually, tomorrow, for those of you who might be interested, our young scholar will be speaking downtown at the Holland & Hart Law Firm over the noon hour on the topic of recent state law developments for renewable energy. CLE credit is available, and if you're interested, you can register on the Stegner Center website and get additional information there. On November 29th, we will be hosting, as part of the Stegner Center Lecture Series, a book signing and presentation on energy sprawl solutions, balancing global development and conservation, with the author Joseph Kiesecker, who's a lead scientist for the Nature Conservancy's Conservation Lands team. And then in the spring semester, March 21st, 22nd, we will host our 24th annual symposium on the topic of recreation challenges on public lands. The program is being keynoted by former Secretary of the Interior Sally Jewell. We'll have a diverse array of speakers addressing this looming issue on public lands, not only here in Utah but elsewhere, including panels that will address Wasatch Front recreation issues and recreation issues in the Moab area. A logistical announcement that you hear at all public events these days: please turn off cell phone ringers. We're very pleased to welcome today Outka as our 14th annual Stegner Center Young Scholar. The Young Scholar program was founded in 2005 with the goal of recognizing and establishing a relationship with promising scholars early in their academic careers. We select recipients of this recognition on the basis of their accomplishments and the quality of their academic work and the promise that they hold in the fields of environmental and natural resources law and policy. We've been honored over the years to host an elite group of scholars who've gone on to do great things, and we expect no less of our young scholar this year. I'd like to thank the Cultural Vision Fund, which is the founding donor and our sole donor for the Young Scholars Program. The Cultural Vision Fund also provides support for a variety of other Stegner Center programs, including our symposium, our lecture series, and our periodic conferences. Our young scholar today, as I mentioned, is Outka, professor at the University of Kansas School of Law since 2011, where she's also an affiliate faculty member of the Environmental Studies program, the Center for Environmental Policy, and the Institute for Social and Policy Research. She works in the area of renewable energy and the transition to a low-carbon electricity sector. Her scholarship has appeared in such law journals as the Vanderbilt Law Review, the Ecology Law Quarterly, the Colorado Law Review, and the Stanford Environmental Law Journal. She teaches courses in energy law, property, environmental law, and climate change law and policy. In 2013, she received the Moreau Faculty Award from the students at the College of Law. And in 2015, she was recognized with the campus-wide Sustainability Leadership Faculty Award at the University of Kansas. We're very pleased to welcome Professor Outka. Thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I appreciate that introduction and owe a debt of thanks to not only Professor Kiter, Professor Craig, Professor Davies, but also Jan Nystrom and Spencer Cope, who've helped to arrange for this this travel and visit here. I know you all appreciate the value of the Stegner Center to your own university community, but I just want to take a moment here at the outset to convey that the value of the center really does extend far beyond Utah's bounds. The work of the center is, I have relied on extensively over the years to enrich my own knowledge and understanding of natural resource topics, and the faculty here are just at the highest level. So it's a real honor to be with you today. This is a dynamic time in energy and environmental law, particularly where the boundaries of these fields, such as they are most blurred. 2 years ago, the United States President was working to chart a low-carbon trajectory for the energy sector and the economy more broadly. Today, the United States President is working to accelerate fossil fuel production and adjust to loosen environmental regulations on coal and oil and gas industries. At the federal level, it's a significant reversal of course. So the loss of federal leadership in climate policy on the one hand, and the renewed interest and focus on fossil fuels on the other, is each significant, undoubtedly with implications that will continue into the future. Yet, understanding the United States system of federalism, the federal-state relationship, the scope of individual state powers, is a constant reminder that federal policy, while obviously extremely important, can be complemented and even counterbalanced through state lawmaking. So broadly speaking, we can see that the federal reemphasis on fossil fuels makes the low-carbon energy policy project one that's highly decentralized at this point in the United States. So with a focus on renewable energy, I'm devoting this year's Stegner Lecture to the policy trends and experimentation that are shaping energy law in this area in the states today. So in doing so, I'd like to focus in three distinct areas that I think, and the reason I choose them is because I think each of these offer a state perspective on energy law's current moment from a very different vantage point. So the first is evolving public law for supporting low-carbon electric power. The second is new measures to harness consumer demand for clean power from large electricity users. And then the third is innovative, inclusive energy policy reforms in support of low-income households. So three related but I think very different vantage points from which to evaluate and assess what's happening in evolving state energy law. The first engages federalism directly. Right? The focus is on what states that remain keen to cut emissions from the energy sector can do to advance that goal on a jurisdictionally fragmented electric grid. As we'll see, some states are building on the progress that they have developed to date with enhanced or more stringent versions of earlier policy models, or expanding from renewable to clean energy more broadly. The second it turns outward to link state energy law to consumer demand. And we see private sector demand for clean power growing as an increasing number of the biggest electricity consumers, companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, a lot of these companies that you see making these pledges for 100% renewable energy, looking to shift their energy consumption to renewable resources. So we'll survey some of how the states are responding in that regard. And then the third also links to consumers, but it links state policy objectives with consumer needs on the opposite side of the spectrum. So if at one end of the spectrum, states are crafting law to meet demand for the biggest consumers, on this end, we're looking at the smallest scale, the household. and particularly policy focused on easing the energy burden for low-income households. So in the time we have, I want to address each of these in turn, and then consider the potential policy complementarity, potential conflicts between them as many states advance along one or more of these policy pathways. So, and finally, leading into discussion, I'll situate state energy law for renewables in relation to other elements of a modern low-carbon grid. So if we think first about evolving state energy law for low-carbon electricity, this is probably the most familiar area. State energy law has long been the primary source for the most prominent legal instrument for promoting renewable energy in the United States, the Renewable Energy Standard, or the Renewable Portfolio Standard, RPS, as you'll hear that acronym. You have probably the nation's most knowledgeable scholar on RPS on your faculty, and Professor Davies. And as he's addressed in depth, it's a legal form, a model that has never taken off at the federal level, but in its varied state versions has been credited with stimulating early renewable energy development across much of the nation. So the prominence of the RPS is a useful place to start in assessing state energy law for a modern grid today, in part because it helps us to understand what's changing in the landscape. So to illustrate, here's a map that's probably familiar to many of you, depicting states that either have RPS mandates or aspirations, and showing that a majority of states have such a mechanism in place. On the one hand, you may not be able to see the numbers as clearly due to the size, but on the one hand, you see some very high targets. So you see California listed at 60%, Oregon at 50%, New York at 50%, Hawaii at 100%. And so one aspect of the changing landscape is energy law being accelerated to achieve these goals, an intensification of state ambition. On the other hand, we're not seeing new RPS in states that never adopted one. And moreover, if we take a closer look, even just at this map, we see that a good number of these measures have timed out of their horizon. So if we take those out of the picture, and I'm going to cross out my state of Kansas, even though it's not 2020 yet, but you know, it's aspirational and we're already past that anyway. It's a different map, isn't it? Right? So we see it in fact, you know, when we look at these, we see the RPS is in a sense waxing and waning as a legal instrument in different registers. So this shows that the RPS is no longer in use in a majority of states in the way that it was traditionally. But so what are the states with the X's on them? What do we take from this? Does it suggest that renewable energy is no longer a salient policy objective in those states? And I think the answer is, you know, definitely a nuanced one, and there's going to be particularities for every state context. But on the whole, I think people would say the answer is no. And so if you look at this slide and you look at the Great Plains states, for example, this slide shows electricity generated from wind and solar in selected states. You'll see Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota, North Dakota, those plain states that were listed with X's down the middle have exceeded the renewable energy targets that they had originally set. They haven't increased the goal or they mandate it to drive it further, but they've exceeded it. And I think, you know, essentially the renewable energy industry is now established in those states. Market forces are continuing to drive the growth trajectory. Some say this means the RPS performed its function and it's no longer needed. I'm not inclined to draw that conclusion so quickly myself. If the RPS was a useful policy signal to developers, in leading up to the result that we have now, wouldn't North Dakota or Kansas benefit from heightened ambition if the goal is to expand renewable energy further? But this is a subject of debate. Perhaps we can discuss it more at the end. But it's worth noting as well, when we're talking about governmental aims for renewable energy, that in the midterm elections there were at least 2 ballot initiatives to increase the stated ambition to make it more stringent. Arizona and Nevada, it failed in Arizona. It succeeded in Nevada to increase the renewable energy target to 50% by 2030. So that's it's being forced to do it from the outside. It's not being led by state government there, but we still see the utilization of that mechanism. An adjacent development in state energy law, high profile but less widespread, is the emergence of state zero emission measures that extend beyond renewables to nuclear power plants, which states value for providing zero carbon emissions electricity. So here, unlike in the RPS context, where the measures are, the measures aren't so much designed to spur new nuclear power development as they are to keep the existing nuclear power plants operational by extending their life. And this fall, the Seventh Circuit and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals both affirmed lower court decisions in those states upholding these state energy laws that are in effect subsidizing nuclear power plants with state-issued credits for the zero emission attributes of electricity that they generate. So both cases were brought by electric industry stakeholders. They challenged the measures, arguing they were preempted by the Federal Power Act, violate the Dormant Commerce Clause, and they've been high-profile cases that I flag here simply in this context, simply because they were being closely watched by those who are invested in the success of renewable energy standards, because if the holdings had been negative, that could have potentially undercut the legal foundation for state renewable energy laws that are still the touchstone policy measure for many states. So the courts of appeals were not convinced to narrow the space for state energy policy making as a result of those challenges. So the effect is that these cases, at least as they stand now, preserve a fair amount of latitude for states within the bounds set by a 2016 Supreme Court opinion that invalidated a Maryland law that was trying to promote generation conditioned the payment of subsidy funds on their participation in a market. That's a complex case, but it set sort of the boundaries against which we expected and saw these challenges coming to see, well, does this case now, what's the domino effect of that case? How many things will it invalidate? Here, the courts have put a stop, at least around these clean energy provisions. Turning to the second distinct area I want to focus on is measures that are designed to harness corporate demand for renewable energy. You probably have seen a lot of headlines lately. They're jumping out at me. They may be jumping out at you. For one company or another pledging, we're going to be 100% renewable, 100% renewable energy. This is a laudable and ambitious goal that many companies have. 5 years ago, this is not all brand new, but it's been building in force and number. 5 years ago, Google made headlines for pledging to buy enough renewable energy to cover 100% of the electricity that its operations consume. And so for a company like Google, they have data centers running 24 hours a day. Their carbon footprint from electricity is massive. And in reaching their goal last year, they celebrated their status, claimed to be I don't doubt the claim necessarily, that they are the biggest corporate buyer of renewable energy on the planet, and celebrating that fact. You can read in depth about how they achieved it and the limits of what they've done. There's a lot of information about it. The point here is they're far from alone in having that ambition. It's become a significant trend, seeking low-cost renewable energy, other means to cut energy use, and companies garner attention for their size, and their, companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon, they're the household names, but there are many other smaller companies also seeking ways to do this. And in 2016, when there was a survey of businesses on what was their stance with regard to renewable energy, over 70% of the business respondents said they were actively trying to acquire renewable energy. So this is something that is particularly relevant for state energy law, because commercial and industrial customers, who these companies represent, are in general going to be retail customers of a utility, and they've had a unique position on the electric grid and in the regulatory environment for some time. They're commonly referred to as C&I customers, commercial and industrial. And these corporate consumers interact with utilities, project developers, wholesale markets in ways that are markedly different from the way any of us would as residential customers of electricity. So residential customers are much more numerous, but together only account for about 37% of the electricity that's used. In contrast, if you combine commercial and industrial consumers together, it's over 60%, 63% of electricity consumption is centered in a much smaller number of larger users. So as a result of this profile, companies are important consumers from a range of perspectives. They can get attention for the things that they want to achieve. From the perspective of utilities, obviously one commercial or industrial customer is the equivalent of serving a much larger number of residential customers. This gives them a way to leverage in securing advantageous programs in some instances. From the perspective of state and local governments, companies have leverage to the extent that public officials have an economic interest in attracting or retaining a commercial or industrial enterprise to the area. From an environmental perspective, if there are changes in the way that commercial and industrial consumers use electricity, the excitement from that community is that could have an outsized impact on reducing the greenhouse gas footprint of the electricity sector. So all of this combines to create a unique position on the grid for commercial and industrial consumers of electricity. You see this in rate making, where the context where a state commission is setting rates for different classes of customers. Also emerging areas of importance. There you have a unique position with regard to demand response, with regard to energy efficiency policy. So for these reasons, as some of electric utilities' largest customers, if they want access to renewable energy, they are in a position, absent regulatory barriers, to drive renewable energy development at a scale, with a scale that matches their demand. And I show you here the picture that I put is Target with rooftop solar. Target is the biggest user of rooftop solar, but much of the renewable energy that's being driven, and what's really getting even more attention, is the large-scale, utility-scale wind farms and solar projects around the country being driven by corporate demand. So the problem for them, though, has been how state energy law is trying to respond, is that although access to renewable energy is desirable for many companies, the laws in many of the states essentially don't allow any clear connection between a company that wants renewables and a renewable energy producer. So there have been creative creative lawyers working on complex legal arrangements to get around those barriers, but that has really only worked for the biggest consumers. So there's a pent-up demand from the smaller C&I customers that don't have the capacity to arrange, complex legal structures. So most of the companies are relying on the purchase of renewable energy credits, and often unbundled from the renewable energy that is generated in and of itself, or the electricity that's generated to support those RECs. But RECs, separate from the underlying electricity, have been falling out of favor for many companies. It's still the number one way that companies try to meet their 100% pledges or 50% pledges, whatever the case may be. But many of the biggest companies have been fairly vocal in saying this is not what they want anymore. They want to actually advance, they object to RECs unbundled for the electricity because it's not purchasing it doesn't mean that they're contributing to a new facility being built. It could already be a facility that's already operational. And if they want to be able to claim we're helping to drive new renewable energy development, then they want to see that's the wind farm that we helped build and that's supplying the energy to our facility. So there's also been an interest in centering the production in the locale, or at least within the same regional grid that the companies are operating in. But if you think about it, if C&I customers represent over 60% of U.S. electricity consumption, this shift has real policy significance for the goal of accelerating clean energy in the near term, and we're already seeing that effect. Much of the new renewable energy has come as a direct result from corporate deals. This is a slide showing corporate deals starting 2013 through to today. This is constantly updated by the Business Renewable Center of the Rocky Mountain Institute, and there's significant growth resulting from the deals that these companies are arranging. The Advanced Energy Economy Institute has been tracking this trend and supporting the state law reforms to meet this demand, and in part because they estimate that there's nearly 450 gigawatts of renewable energy that could be developed if half of C&I customers' energy was met with renewables. That would be 4 times the wind and solar that we have in the United States today. So some states are now realizing that this also has a potential economic opportunity for them, especially if a company wants to come to a state and build a facility near their offices. And so states that can ease regulatory pathways and connect companies with renewable energies do stand to benefit potentially. So we're seeing an expanding suite of policy instruments that are now improving the regulatory environment for businesses, particularly in the form of green tariffs. This is a slide just showing what sectors have been most active. The technology sector has been the most significant because of the data centers that they're so reliant on electricity, manufacturing, communications, and this is from 2018. The Retail Industry Leaders Association, though, so also retailers, large retailers, Target, IKEA, Walmart, developed this ranking of the states to see where is clean energy procurement most, best, which of these state environments are most amenable to corporate procurement. And so these are ranked, and I find this really interesting. We don't have time to dwell on it too long, but one of the things that we can see is that it's easiest for states that are in regional transmission organizations. So about 60% of the country has a regionally operated part of the grid. We see that. We also see some of the states that have already allow retail choice. That means letting customers choose who they get electricity from. It's easier for the companies in those states. But so this trend is I think it's fair to say this trend has implications as policy industry stakeholders are reassessing the traditional utility model. And there's some cautionary notes that need to be struck, I think, in connection with this as well. But on the whole, as business models are being reassessed, as electric grid operations are being tested against new changes in this field. What energy services will be valued by consumers most? If we think of this in the broader sense of this transition, we see that state energy law is responding to these company pledges as part of an increasingly active recognition that there are increasingly active consumers on the grid. They're no longer passively receiving whatever electricity rates the utility established with their utility commission in their state. And this is just a set of principles that the companies have used in public utility dockets. In the state of Kansas, for example, the utility filed a docket with, filed an application for approval of a tariff, green tariff, and included as an attachment the corporate renewable energy buyers principles that was developed by these companies and nonprofit groups to say we're trying to match what the companies have asked for. Just to give you this picture for a moment to show you how much has changed in a short time. This is a map from May of 2017, and I'm showing you where there's been new policies in place put in place since that time. So already, if I could change the color on that map, you would see a different set of circumstances. And there may be one or more that I'm not aware of, but at least of the ones that I'm aware of, you see that there's been change in this regard. So now let's turn our attention from the big energy consumer at one end of the spectrum to the smallest scale consumer, the household, on the other end of the spectrum. This is an area that I'm working on right now and adjacent to some work on the corporate buyers. And I think it's really interesting because when household electricity is considered in energy law, it's primarily through one of two related lenses. One is through a broad and generalized affordability principle that's implicit in the mandate that rates be reasonable. State public utility commissions have to set reasonable rates, and those are applicable to households as retail residential customers of a utility. So that's a very broad sense. And then the second is a narrow and individualized assessment of need in the disbursement of home energy assistance. So on the one hand, it's very broad, it's a balancing for what's reasonable, and then in the other context, it's very narrow to see who needs assistance. So retail rate making, it's at the heart of state energy law governance. So you have state public utility commissions balancing the revenue requirements of a utility, which is meant to cover costs as well as a rate of return for shareholders against the burden of paying electricity bills on customers. And they're always balancing these two to find what's a reasonable rate. And energy burden, the term used for how much of your income is devoted to paying for energy costs, it's higher for low-income households. And it's basically, within energy law, just accepted as a matter of course that some households won't be able to afford to pay their electric bill even when that affordability mandate is followed. So the slide here is showing the percentage of households that experience some kind of insecurity in their access to energy over different temporal spans. So over 30% of households report that they have some kind of energy insecurity, and then others showing that they would forego basic necessities to pay an electric bill, weighing, do you buy groceries or do you keep the electricity on? That this is a thought process and a conversation in a good number of households. So responding to energy burden for low-income households is energy law, but it has been conceived over time as social policy, right? Rather than an issue that could drive policy in the energy space. It's a supplemental, responsive social policy addition rather than part of energy law is how it's been thought of. So to understand what's starting to happen in state energy law in this area, it's important to consider the federal backdrop for states' attention to low-income households. Federal low-income policy has been mostly static for close to 40 years. 1981, Congress established the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, which has operated in basically the same form ever since. this is a slide simply showing what you could expect would be the case, that within the number of households that are struggling with energy insecurity, the lower the income, the higher the struggle. The more children in the home, the higher the struggle. Age and race and age of the home have different effects on this as well. So the basics, all that LIHEAP is designed to do is provide funding from the federal government that goes to the states and is used to help people pay their bills under certain circumstances. It's different from some of the other social policy programs where it's and where people will characterize it as entitlement, which I put in quotes because I'm not sure that's the right way to refer to it, but this is an application-based program. It has to be approved every year by Congress. So Congress, in an annual ritual, has to approve funding. It goes to Health and Human Services, which funnels the funds to state and tribal grantees according to a formula, sends it to sub-grantees, community action agencies, sometimes local governments, and they will screen and prioritize among the household applications that they receive, and then they fund, either mostly heating, but in some places cooling, for a subset of eligible households. And it's well understood that this LIHEAP does not come close to meeting the need that exists. In some states, the majority of people who apply are turned away. So at the state level, it's exciting against this backdrop to see that there are beginning to be innovations in low-income energy law that moves away from the incremental support model to actually directing clean energy technology through policy to help alleviate the need for energy assistance. Totally different model. There are a few examples, but there's constantly new examples, but I'll just name a few. The state of Illinois, as part of the same legislation that enacted the zero emission credits measure, established a Solar for All program that will start in the spring. This will direct rooftop solar technology to low-income areas, both residential and community solar, as well as the nonprofit agencies and public organizations that assist those same communities. In the state of California, the Public Utility Commission has adopted a suite of programs that are designed around this same goal. How do we get energy efficiency and renewable energy onto the rooftops where the change that could make in the bill makes the most difference? So responding to the very same set of framework and concepts that are built into the federal program, but turning them in another direction so that it reduces need. They've just recently developed, I think it was earlier this summer, a disadvantaged community green tariff, and they have a definition of a disadvantaged community based on what percentage people within a community fall below a certain income level, providing a 20% discount on participation in a community solar farm. These are just examples. In New York, where there's a comprehensive reform process ongoing, integrating the needs of low-income households and connecting it with renewable resources has been a central focus. So I think what's especially promising about these early, and I don't want to overstate the proliferation, but it is, if you're watching for it, you start seeing that there's a lot of movement in this direction. What's especially promising, I think, about these early developments, and if they can proliferate, is that they can advance the modern grid in at least two critical ways. One is, in my view, it represents a long overdue reform to make energy law more inclusive. It moves beyond the simple affordability balancing of costs for consumers versus profits for shareholders, and shows that energy law can actively advance clean energy to reduce energy burden for low-income households. Second is that in doing so, where it's successful in doing that, states can ease the public acceptability of this transition and undercut efforts to politicize low-income energy burden in ways that some utilities have tended to do, when in fact that counters the long-term interests of the very households that are being protected. So, of course, in the context of rate making, the Utility Commission is very concerned about what will the effect of a particular policy be on the lowest income ratepayers. But at the same time, these are showing that there's ways to think about that question, not just in the rate making context, and actually directing those technologies in a way that will be helpful. So taking these three areas of modern state energy law together, law and policy to stimulate low carbon electricity, meeting business demand for clean power, addressing low income energy burdens, a word about governance challenges that are particular to the states. One is that each state that's advancing policy objectives does so in the face of status quo, physical, and legal infrastructure. That's a big challenge for every state. That's also a challenge at the federal level, but each state has its own unique set of resources and facilities, right? So those of you who followed the developments of the Clean Power Plan a year or so ago, which was an approach to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the electric power sector, they tried to account for that the fact that there's differences state by state in how they get their electricity. But that's a real challenge. States have to contend with being part of a grid system that extends beyond their own borders, right? So this requires a careful approach to policy design. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, although about 60% of the countries within the grid or within the footprint of a regional transmission organization has some kind of coordinated markets without access. Some are, the remaining states are essentially operating in a fairly isolated environment without access to the innovations that those markets are able to drive. And so there's room for that, those boundaries to change, and they may over time. But implication of that, for example, is that states with an RTO footprint, even if they don't have retail choice, have been more attractive to businesses who want to put a wind farm there or a solar farm. So in these remarks, I've mostly focused on state energy law related to renewable energy. But we know that's not enough to advance a modern low-carbon grid. There's a range of complementary elements from energy efficiency, well-functioning electric power markets, energy storage, electric vehicle integration, to highlight some of the most important. So this suggests, I think, that a critical question should be, how can states approach renewable energy policy in ways that can advance these complementary elements at the same time? And so let's return for a moment to the shifting RPS landscape noted earlier. To the extent that states are trying to accommodate companies' renewable energy pledges with new wind and solar projects, the new green tariffs are, in some of the states, performing a function adjacent to the RPS, except that private demand rather than state policy is driving that new growth. Often these are just taking place in the Public Utility Commission dockets without executive or legislative leadership. So it's an interesting inverse, right, with government institutions reacting or responding rather than leading in a particular direction. And these measures are not necessarily incompatible, depending on whether utilities that are subject to an RPS can still meet their requirements while conveying the renewable energy credits to a company, which is what they would like. But if you really look at the complementarity of these elements and these various measures, it can be very difficult to assess without a thoroughgoing, inclusive review process like only a few states have begun. I think it's probably fair to say that California has been in sort of a long arc of doing that. But otherwise, really, you would look to New York, you would look to Hawaii, where they're really stepping back to say, what needs to change here to modernize all that we're doing in the electricity sector? And not very many states have done that yet. Part of the reason for this is that at the state level, new energy governance can arise in a number of contexts. It can be from executive leadership, right? So we just had a number of new governors elected in the midterms who had made campaign pledges about their support for renewable energy. Maybe we'll see that begin in those states. It could be through legislative action or through the Utility Commission dockets, where much of the corporate-focused law has changed. And it's just a reality that in the PUC setting, utilities are in a very strong position. So the utility culture of a state, especially in traditionally regulated states, significantly affects whether and how new energy laws crafted at the state level. So, and it's a challenging environment for clean energy advocates to participate in. And that's not to say that they don't or they can't, because they do, but they are doing so in a way where the discourse is often initially framed by the utilities, and there's a structural advantage that's built on longstanding institutional norms and relationships that they have to contend with. It's just how it's different from the broad public dialogue that might happen around a new legislative measure, for example. So, in considering what renewable energy law in the states is today, that is actively evolving in some states, static or languishing in others, it becomes clear, I think, that anticipating a modern low-carbon grid will depend on, as just a handful of states are beginning to do, deliberately integrating the complementary elements. And this is against the need, an urgent call to accelerate renewable energy development in the next 10 years, right? The United Nations report from just earlier in this fall really narrowing that time frame of when the urgency of action applies. So without integration, for example, there's a risk of rapid vehicle electrification without decarbonizing electricity fast enough. And the financial reports are essentially saying, yes, markets are driving renewable energy in some of those states, but we're not at the point that, this was in just a couple of weeks ago, the latest Lazard report, which analyzes the costs of various resources, saying we're not at the point where markets are going to take us where we need to be fast enough. And so this means there's still a strong need for a systemic governing preference for low carbon resources. You know, we're still here in the United States. So we have all those RPS, there's all this happening with the companies, but we're still at 17% renewables. There's a long way to go in the United States towards low carbon energy. A couple of quick points to move along a little bit faster. These are slides referencing the progress that I just referred to, and just forgot to press the slide button for you. Sorry. The other, talking about the risks of failing to integrate. On the one hand, you know, this is a graph showing how, in addition to integration, planning long term. If we're aiming for a modern grid, state energy law can begin to say, as could federal, but we're talking, if we just focus on states, to really look forward and say, if we're looking far into the future. And the reason to do that is because you could see benefits in short run with certain decisions, and that could then lock in infrastructure that really doesn't get you past a plateau midway. So this is a graph that's trying to illustrate that point from the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, saying we need to think about this in the long term. How is decarbonization of electricity going to interact with vehicle electrification and energy efficiency measures and the like, rather than simply saying we have a goal to 2030, we reach that, but wait, we built technology and infrastructure that keeps us there, and we actually wanted to keep going. So I think it's striking to me as I think about these issues and talk about them with you today that we have really never had a real chance for a national discussion on the possibilities of far-reaching, deeply informed, effective federal policy for a modern low-carbon grid. Clean Power Plan might be the closest that we came, and it was confined to the Clean Air Act. It was very highly controversial. It's being derailed. It's so and even then it was in a limited form. So in the absence of comprehensive, forward-looking federal approach to modern energy grid, you know, this is, state energy law can advance at a smaller scale. So states have the legal ability to make deep reforms. And the outlines of a modern low-carbon grid are becoming increasingly defined, despite the turn at the federal level. It's taking shape. What it should look like is taking shape, and we know what those elements are. Now it's a matter of fitting those pieces together. So I anticipate that more states will begin to initiate this effort. And if you look at this final slide, this is tracking states and cities that have said they still are committed to the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in alignment with international agreements. And if you add them all together, it's a significant, at least in terms of GDP, a significant force. So they're trying to, if states can initiate these efforts, and the process will take a long time, it may be that over time there will be, and hope maybe not too far into the future, there may be a time where those states can inform a national dialogue about these issues for how to advance modern energy policy, not just state by state, but for the United States as a whole. I'll stop there and thank you for your interest and attention, and happy to take your questions and thoughts. Hi.
As corporate buyers go after usually long-term contracts and cheap renewable energy, in a state without a strong RPS, that means that residential customers and smaller companies and smaller corporate buyers are sort of by default left with the energy mix that the state has, which is much more heavily relying on fossil fuels, older plants, more expensive plants, and so it seems like there's two divergent futures that are beginning to take place. But I'm curious if you've seen states or maybe the companies themselves addressing how to reconcile that.
So I hope everyone could hear her question. Did everyone could hear? Repeat it. So the question, great question, whether if you have companies that are making deals for renewable energy, she's pointing out that then the rest of the customers on the grid are getting whatever is the residual mix, which would be heavier in fossil fuels, and whether companies or states are addressing that in some way. This is a really excellent point to make, because it's really, when you see that 100% renewable pledge, right, it conveys a certain message, right, that Apple is using only renewable energy now. And that isn't true. What they've done is match, but they've calculated and matched what their use is with what is with an amount of renewable energy that's being generated, and then if they help to bring that renewable energy into operation, then claiming that as a match to what they've operated. But they are operating on the same grid that everyone else is. And so it's really important to recognize that there's a way that it could seem like, well, we must really be making a lot of progress if all of the biggest consumers are now using 100% renewable energy. Well, we're making progress to the extent that they've actually added new renewable energy onto the grid. But they're also still depending on the fact that there is a mix on the grid. And that's something that I think is lost in, which is not to say that it's not good that they're pushing in this way. I'm not saying that that isn't the case. But they're still using the same electricity that everyone is using. They're just incrementally making that mix cleaner by adding wind and solar. Now, some people might say, well, if it's possible to get that energy, why can't that be available to everyone? And in some cases, you'll see if a project couldn't happen if not for their participation in that project. And so in those cases, public utility commissions will have begun to establish a green tariff that lets them really get the benefit of the low-cost project that wouldn't have happened without them. But that's another reason why, to me, the other side of the spectrum is encouraging to see it's best if we aren't only approaching it from the standpoint of meeting needs of the biggest electricity consumers, but they're still using the same residual mix that anyone else is. Yeah, Robin. Well, at least most of the big companies are doing a mix because the rooftop isn't enough to cover their use. So they might Target might put the maximum that they can cover on their side of the meter, right, with the rooftop solar, and then do the rest, cover the rest if they can through one of these renewable energy deals. But the rooftop just can't get them far enough when they're that big of when they have that big of an electricity bill. So they pursue it, but then they kind of try to balance it more often. Yes, sir.
You mostly spoke about energy, but you really were speaking about electricity.
True.
And there's a lot of, we have no renewable gasoline, we have no renewable natural gas. What about that? I mean, the electricity is sexy. You can go see the devices for doing it, but I don't see much happening in terms of renewable natural gas energy or hydrocarbon energy.
Yeah, excellent point. He made the point, oh, sorry, I didn't repeat Robin's question, but his point is we've talked a lot about electricity, but what about energy more broadly? And oil and gas that are used in heating and other transportation, and what about that? The focus on electricity is in large part because it's easier to change. It's an easier sector to change. And some of the functions that we rely on fossil fuels for, transportation, heating, can be switched to electric. And that's why there's been a big focus on electrification, both for transportation and down the road thinking about, less reliance on natural gas for heating, more on electricity. But that's why an integration is really necessary, because if you are successful in switching those over, but you haven't decarbonized the electric grid, you haven't made the kind of change that was anticipated. But it's easier to shift the electric power sector than it is to replace the fuels that are being used. So what the main response is to shift what those functions are relying on. Can you shift them from relying on those fuels to relying on an electric grid that's increasingly low carbon? It's a very challenging shift, economy-wide shift that would be required to really make it happen. That's true, yeah. And energy, when you say energy, it includes all of the uses of energy and electricity is a smaller subset of that. So renewable energy constitutes a higher percentage of our electricity consumption than it does our energy consumption overall, because that includes transportation, which is now, very recently, surpassed electricity in the greenhouse gas emissions. Electric power was contributing the most over time for many, many years, and reductions in emissions in electric power and increased trajectory for transportation meant the two lines crossed. He's asking whether states are doing much in regard to trying to cut emissions from transportation and heating fuels, you said? Hydrocarbons in general. From vehicles is harder because states, aside from California, have been limited in what they can do by federal legislation. There are clear preemption provisions that are limiting on states in trying to change the greenhouse gas emissions, levels for vehicles. So there is some effort, but it's not as robust, and that's in part because of legal limitations. But there are, states have tried to reduce emissions from, contain methane from drilling, and I mean, states have been active in attempting to do some of these things, but it's not as robust as it has been for renewables, and it's not an area that I've studied as closely to be able to say state by state, other than a few of them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes. Given that traditional utilities have had a business model of investment cost recovery and generation, are there any legislative or policy bodies that are looking at ways to define the future utility, given that they are succumb to this market cannibalization by distributed generation? So the short answer is I don't see the traditional utility business model being sustainable in the future. Is there anyone thinking about that, talking about that, building a framework for that?
Yeah. So his point is, as we shift to renewable resources, particularly distributed resources, which are on the demand side of the meter, cut into electricity sales, the traditional utility business model doesn't seem to match a future where that's growing. And I'm just saying how I receive your question, and is what kind of work is being done at the state level to reform business model, to the utility business model, so that it matches a modern grid structure. And that's exactly the kind of policy that you approach. It's so far-reaching. That's sort of the fundamental function of the Utility Commission. And if that's going to change, it's a broader conversation that, it's a broader policy dialogue that needs to take place. Yes, there's a lot of people talking about it, and a lot from the outside in the advocacy world, trying to introduce and educate new model prospects to public utility commissions, but also legislatures, and trying to find ways to show utilities there is a pathway to, adapting what you do and the, important services you provide to a new form, to a new setting. But it is slow, and without external leadership, it's hard to see how, from within the confines of a public utility commission, that will be defined. Not to say it couldn't happen, but it's something that will probably have to reach beyond just a commission setting. But I think that is what that's what Hawaii is trying to reform the entire structure. They want to be 100% renewable. And they aren't in a regional transmission organization, they're in the ocean. So they have a completely unique, for the United States, kind of context. And in order to try to reach that goal, they're really trying to look at how can we completely rewrite this to match the future we want to have. And I'm not saying their process is perfect. Of course, no process is going to be. But New York is trying to do that as well. And it may be that some more states kind of follow their lead to be willing to ask those harder questions.
So I'm curious, early in your slide presentation, you showed the various states that had the RPS standards and then the ones that were achieving various levels of success. Can you make any observations in some of the non-succeeding states? Why this is working in some places and not others? Is it simply politics? Is it the type of energy resources that are available? Are there other factors that go into that?
Well, I would say, at least speaking from my sense of what's happening in Kansas and some of the states where I put in a bunch of X's, but you also have a lot of growth, I think that there's a preference for a market-based growth trajectory. It's preferred, I think, to have that now, if wind can stand on its own, we don't want to have a mandate to do more. You can't detract from the success. It has been very successful in those Plains states. So I think that area is very different from the Southeast, because they've actually had a lot of success in the Great Plains states. And Iowa and Kansas are, in terms of the percentage of wind that they produce, is the highest in the country, even though Texas produces the most in quantity. As a percentage of generation, Kansas and Iowa are the highest. The Southeast is interesting because, unlike a good portion of the Great Plains states are in an RTO, the Southeast is not. And that's been, I think, a pretty significant factor to having this work as well as it does. I've breezed past this because I was concerned about time, but this is a really interesting slide to me, because on the red, this is the Southwest Power Pool in the red. And so all of the renewable energy and other resources that are generated in this footprint are coordinated by the Southwest Power Pool for everyone in that region. And those are, if you recall the RPS map with the X's, a lot of those states were the states right in here. So my feeling as a Kansan is we could still be more ambitious and aim higher even than the 35-36% that we've reached in terms of our own state, because we get electricity through the Southwest Power Pool. What the picture on the other side is showing is some discussions around an expansion and whether expanding the power pool footprint westward would be beneficial or not. And that's an ongoing conversation that hasn't come to a clear conclusion. But even that red footprint was expanded northward to the Canadian border, and in a way that allowed for much higher penetrations of renewable energy over time. So Southwest Power Pool has well exceeded 60% at instances in time without any threat to the grid whatsoever. So a lot of the fears have been alleviated about what could be achieved in terms, despite the intermittency. It's not been maintained at that, but you can look at that. You can go to SPP at any time of day and see exactly what percentage of wind is serving this entire footprint. Southeast, which is the other big area, they don't have an RTO. It's traditionally regulated. Support for renewable energy has, on the whole, been very low. And I associate that with, in part, not as rich of a resource as in the case of wind, but also that the utility, without legislative or executive leadership, you have very traditional utility culture that is, not looking for change. But there's really no reason, for example, that the state of Florida, the Sunshine State, could not have a very high production of renewable energy. They could, but they don't. And I think that that's partly not having access to regional markets, but also very traditional utility culture. That's my perception. Yeah.
Our area here, utility, has a Blue Sky program where customers pay more for wind power and so on. Have you looked into that at all, and has that helped as far as the renewable portfolio growth at all?
Yeah, so I don't know your exact program, but I think it might be, sounds like it's similar to a program that's offered in Kansas, where you can sign up for a certain percentage of your electricity to come from renewable energy, and you'll pay a surcharge that's on the small side. And what those essentially do is, the programs I'm familiar with, what they do is they're associated with renewable energy that is being generated, right? So it's indirectly, if it's driving renewable energy, it's doing so in an indirect way by you conveying, if you signed up for the program, I support renewable energy development. But it's coming from a facility that's already been built. And so in that effect, when people understand that, some people say, well, I don't really want to participate because I'm just donating a little extra for something that's already happening. Others feel I'm happy to pay this small amount to convey, to send that signal that I support this. So it's indirect. A utility typically would not be able to double count if the renewable energy credits go to the customer, it wouldn't be able to count towards their mandate. But typically it's not going to. There's often at least language in the provision that says the utility isn't required to build more renewable energy to meet customers' need in that regard. They'll be able to make that decision on the economic basis that they would otherwise. So it's more indirect.
Uma, let me thank you on behalf of the Stegner Center for this young scholar presentation. Please join me in thanking Uma Outka.